The bells of the convent rang through the mist of dawn. That sound, meant to call for prayer, was now turned into a funeral lament. On the cold stones of the convent of Santa Margherita lay a motionless body. The white robe, a symbol of purity and devotion, was stained with blood. No one in the city of Monza could imagine that behind those sacred doors lay a secret capable of defying the church itself. The inevitable question arises: who was Virginia de Leyva, and why had a convent destined for virtue become a place of death and sin? To understand this story, we must go back to 17th century Europe. At that time, the region of Lombardy was under the rule of the Spanish monarchy. The presence of the House of Habsburg was reflected not only in taxes and the army, but also in religious life. The Catholic Church, after the impact of the Protestant Reformation, launched a campaign of moral control and reaffirmation known as the Counter-Reformation. Women's convents were considered true spiritual fortresses. They functioned as centers of prayer, but also as social and political instruments. For noble families, sending a daughter to a convent meant preserving the family inheritance while showing piety and obedience to the church. In that society, noble women had almost no choice. They could be used as pieces in marriages to strengthen alliances, or they could remain enclosed for life within the walls of a convent. Most of those young women did not enter because of a spiritual vocation, but because of the firm will of their families. In this way, the convent became a sacred prison. Under harsh discipline, among endless prayers and enforced silences, frustrations and forbidden passions were hidden. In this atmosphere of repression and loneliness, inevitable tragedies were born. Among those young women condemned to confinement was Virginia de Leyva, the daughter of a powerful Lombard family. Her life, marked from the beginning by the decisions of others, would soon show how confinement could deform existence and transform obedience into rebellion. And it was precisely at that crossroads between imposed virtue and the desire for freedom that one of the darkest pages of Baroque Italy began to be written. Virginia de Leyva was born in 1575, into the bosom of a noble family from the Lombard region. Her lineage gave her prestige, wealth, and power, but also condemned her to a fate she never chose. She was the daughter of Count Martin de Leyva, a man whose ambition extended beyond the limits of his home and his time. For him, every decision was determined by economic interest and the defense of family honor. At that time, the greatest danger for noble families was the fragmentation of wealth. Each married daughter meant the obligation to provide a considerable dowry, which could weaken the inheritance and diminish the political power of the lineage. To prevent this, many noble parents resorted to a common and cruel practice, sending their daughters to the convent. In this way, they not only avoided the expenses of a marriage but also reinforced the image of a devout and pious family before the church. The destiny of the young women was sealed without them being able to utter a single word in their defense. This is what happened to Virginia. She was barely 13 years old when her father decided that she should wear the habit. At the age when most children were still discovering the world, Virginia was deprived of everything that was yet to come. She was stripped of silk dresses, court dances, and dreams of youth, and locked behind the walls of a convent that would soon appear more as a prison than a refuge. The convent of Santa Margherita in Monza was an imposing stone building, designed to resist the passing of centuries and to inspire respect and fear in those who looked upon it. Behind its thick walls and iron gates, life was ruled by strict discipline. The day began before dawn with the prayers of matins and ended, exhausting, with the prayer of Compline. The young novices spent long hours kneeling on the cold floor, reciting endless litanies. Silence was obligatory, and any transgression could be punished with severe penalties. For Virginia, that place soon became a tomb in life. She had committed no crime, but she lived as a prisoner. The high windows barely allowed the light to enter, the corridors echoed with muffled steps, and the air was filled with the smell of incense and damp stone. The convent was not a sanctuary. It was a sacred prison. Each passing day strengthened the feeling of having been sacrificed in the name of family ambition and the rules of a relentless society. The 13-year-old girl, forced to take her vows, was stripped of all freedom. Beneath the white veil and the crucifix, there still beat the heart of a teenager who longed to live, to laugh, to feel, and to love. But the invisible chains of obedience and duty suffocated each of those impulses. However, what happened to Virginia was not an isolated case. Historical documents confirm that during the 17th century, many daughters of Italian noble families were sent to convents against their will. Statistics indicate that, in certain monasteries, most of the nuns were women confined by family imposition and not by religious vocation. The convent was presented as a place of holiness, but in reality, it acted as an institution created to preserve economic and political interests. In that enclosed world, noble young women shared the same frustration. Confidences were whispered among them, tears were exchanged in the dark cells, and ties of solidarity were born amid despair. Stories of forbidden love, failed escapes, and exemplary punishments circulated as warnings and shattered dreams. Virginia was not alone in her suffering, although the strength of her rebellion and the path she took would lead her to a much more tragic destiny than that of most of her sisters. In the oppressive silence of the convent of Santa Margherita, where every day seemed to repeat itself like an endless echo of prayers and penances, a story began to form that would surpass the stone walls and reach the memory of Europe. There, among the shadows of the cloisters and the murmurs of the litanies, appeared a man who would forever alter the fate of Sor Virginia Maria de Leyva. His name was John Paolo Ossio. Although oral tradition and some writings name him as Ossio, he was a noble young man from the region, ambitious, determined, and accustomed to obtaining what he desired. He had a reputation as seductive as it was dangerous. He often lingered near the convent and around the church of Monza. According to later literary accounts, the first meeting between Virginia and Ossio occurred during a mass. She, hidden behind the veil of a nun, lifted her gaze and met the dark eyes of that man. It was only a brief instant, yet enough to ignite a spark that neither the strict discipline of the convent nor the severity of the church could extinguish. This detail belongs more to the realm of literary interpretation than to judicial records, but it serves to illustrate the beginning of a forbidden bond. The truth is that, in one way or another, Ossio managed to establish contact with Virginia. They began to exchange secret notes, written with trembling hands and hidden between the pages of prayer books or in small folds of fabric. Historical documentation confirms that there was an illicit relationship between them, although the precise beginning remains in the field of narrative reconstruction. What followed became an open defiance of the established order. Virginia, forced to enter the convent against her will, found in Ossio not only a lover but also a symbol of freedom. Each secret encounter was a rebellion against obedience, a desperate affirmation that she was still alive beneath the white habit. Judicial sources mention nocturnal meetings inside the convent, arranged with the assistance of accomplices and behind the backs of the other nuns. In those moments, the nuns ceased to be Sor Virginia Maria and became once again the young Virginia de Leyva, yearning for affection, tenderness, and passion. But such a relationship, founded on secrecy and transgression, could not remain hidden forever. The convent, though silent, was full of watchful eyes and listening ears. It was enough for one mistake for the truth to surface. The first victim of that secret was a young novice named Caterina. According to the records, this girl began to suspect Virginia's behavior and the clandestine presence of Ossio inside the convent. She soon discovered more than she should have and apparently threatened to reveal it. Historical evidence confirms that Caterina died under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was declared an accident, a fall down the convent stairs. However, the rumors of the time and later chronicles hinted at the possibility of a crime. The theory that her death was caused to silence her belongs to narrative and literary interpretation, though it is based on the suspicions that her death provoked. With Caterina's death, the secret was protected for a time. But the cost was too great. Virginia had crossed a line from which she could never return. Soon after, the relationship between Virginia and Ossio produced an even more compromising result. The nun was pregnant inside the convent. Testimonies from the judicial process clearly mention that a secret birth took place, though the details remain lost amid contradictions and silence. The most accepted version suggests that Virginia gave birth in secret, aided by some nuns who shared a pact of silence. The The child born from that union was immediately taken from the mother. The fate of the infant disappeared within the folds of history. Some believe he was given up for adoption. Others say he died shortly after, a victim of the effort to erase every trace of evidence. The only certainty is that the historical record acknowledges the existence of the child, but preserves no information about his destiny. That absence in the documents became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. A human life vanished into the darkness of the archives, erased by the will to conceal the scandal. When it seemed that the secret could remain buried, a new figure appeared, Ottavia. She was a young novice, innocent and pure, who had just arrived at the convent. Her gentleness and innocence immediately drew Virginia's attention, who decided to take her under her protection. According to the records of the trial, Ottavia soon became entangled in the web of secrets that surrounded Virginia and Ossio. Later literature describes her as a victim of slow manipulation, pulled little by little into the hidden connection with the outside world. The crucial point of her tragedy came with the pregnancy. Historical documents confirm that Ottavia became pregnant and died under violent circumstances. The official version spoke of a sudden illness, but the testimonies gathered during the trial pointed to a deliberate act meant to eliminate the danger of a new scandal. The details of her death, told in gruesome terms in certain literary accounts, belong to narrative exaggeration. What remains certain is that Ottavia died in suspicious conditions, and that her pregnancy represented a danger to the silence Virginia and Ossio were trying to preserve. With the death of Caterina, and later of Ottavia, Virginia and Ossio had sealed a dark pact. It was no longer just a forbidden love, but a chain of crimes aimed at protecting the secret. The convent of Santa Margherita, created as a bastion of virtue, had turned into a place of death, concealment, and sin. Rumors started spreading through Monza. The eyes of the faithful became inquisitive. Whispers multiplied. No one dared to accuse openly, yet suspicion grew like an unstoppable shadow. The story of Sister Virginia could no longer remain hidden. What had begun as a clandestine affair was about to become a public scandal of historic proportions. The silence of the convent of Santa Margherita was broken in 1607. An anonymous letter, written with a firm hand and an accusatory tone, reached Cardinal Federico Borromeo, Archbishop of Milan, and one of the most powerful figures of the Church in Italy. The letter described in detail the illicit relationship between Sister Virginia Maria de Leyva and the noble John Paolo Ossio. It spoke of nocturnal encounters, secret pregnancies, and suspicious deaths. That letter became the spark that ignited a process no one could stop. Federico Borromeo was an austere man, determined to cleanse the Church after the scandals of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Upon receiving the accusation, he immediately ordered an investigation. He sent commissioners, notaries, and church officials to question the nuns, review records, and collect statements. What they uncovered confirmed their worst fears. The convent, supposed to be a stronghold of holiness, had become the setting for an illicit affair and acts contrary to Christian morals. Suspicions about the deaths of the novices, traces of a hidden birth, and constant rumors of secret meetings created a disturbing picture. The case soon reached the city. In Milan and Monza, stories began to circulate about the Nun of Monza and her concealed sins. What should have been a private inquiry by the Church turned into a public spectacle. The people, eager for scandalous tales, awaited every new revelation. The trial of Virginia and John Paolo Ossio unfolded with great resonance. The judicial archives preserve records and testimonies that allow the reconstruction of that trial as a true spectacle for the entire city. Citizens gathered in squares to discuss every step of the case. Chroniclers wrote details that fueled public imagination. And the rumors rose like a tide that could no longer be contained. Ossio was the first to be captured. His fame as a nobleman, arrogant and licentious, turned against him. In custody, he denied all charges, but the growing number of proofs and testimonies was impossible to refute. He was declared a direct accomplice in the deaths that took place inside the convent and guilty of having corrupted a consecrated nun. The sentence was clear and harsh. John Paolo Ossio was condemned to death and executed publicly. Historical records indicate that his punishment was carried out with all the rigor of the justice of the time, serving as a warning to society. The news of his fall echoed through northern Italy. The situation of Sister Virginia was different. The ecclesiastical judges found themselves in a dilemma. To apply the death sentence to a woman of noble birth could provoke conflict with her influential family, but to absolve her would damage the authority of the Church. The solution came in an intermediate punishment. Virginia was found guilty of grave transgressions, of violating her vow of chastity and of contributing to the moral corruption of the convent. However, her life was spared. The sentence declared that she must remain permanently confined in the convent of Santa Valeria in Milan, where she would live under a regime of strict isolation until her death. The verdict did not bring freedom, but the opposite. Virginia was shut away in a narrow cell, separated from the rest of the nuns. She was forbidden to speak with others, receive visitors, or take part in community life. She lived in silence, surrounded by bare walls, with only a crucifix for company. The death penalty had turned into a life sentence. People did not stop talking about her. Even though she was imprisoned, her figure became legendary. It was said that at night, heartbreaking cries were heard coming from her cell, echoes of a conscience tormented by the memory of her sins. Others claimed she had written words on the walls with her own blood, leaving messages of despair and remorse. These accounts belong to the realm of rumor and popular imagination. Official documents do not confirm such stories, but their persistence in collective memory shows how Virginia was seen as a being between human and demonic, between victim and monster. One detail is enough to understand the atmosphere. The guards who watched over her claimed they preferred to keep their distance, afraid to witness strange visions or hear inexplicable voices. Thus, Virginia's cell became a place of superstition and fear. The trial of Virginia and the execution of Ossio marked a turning point. For the Church, it was an example of discipline and control. For the people, it was a spectacle that confirmed suspicions of corruption within religious institutions. The image of Sister Virginia remained engraved in collective memory as a symbol of transgression. Her name became synonymous with scandal, and her story was told again and again in squares, taverns, and palaces. The Nun of Monza ceased to be a real woman and turned into a dark myth that crossed centuries. With Virginia's condemnation, the tragedy reached its peak. The young woman who had been forced into the convent against her will had defied every rule and ended up paying with a life of perpetual imprisonment. Her lover had been executed, her children had disappeared into silence, and the deaths surrounding her became wounds impossible to erase. In her cell at Santa Valeria, Virginia became a living ghost. She never saw freedom again. Her days passed in imposed prayers, endless penances, and the echo of memories that haunted her without rest. The woman who once sought love and freedom ended as a symbol of sin and scandal. Virginia de Leyva died in 1650, after nearly 50 years of confinement in the convent of Santa Valeria. Her end was as silent as her life had been tormented. There were no solemn ceremonies, no processions, no words of farewell. Her burial took place without honors, as if the Church wished to close her story forever and erase all trace of the woman who had turned a convent into a scene of sin and crime. Yet death did not silence her name. On the contrary, it began a legacy that would cross centuries and borders. More than 200 years later, the writer Alessandro Manzoni was inspired by Virginia's case to create one of the most remembered figures in his famous novel I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed. On its pages appears the Monica di Monza, a woman torn between sacred vows and forbidden passions. Manzoni softened many of the darkest elements of the real story. He turned Virginia into a literary rather than historical figure, a symbol of human weakness within a rigid society. But the echo of true events remained, reminding readers that fiction was rooted in authentic tragedy. Since then, the name of the Monica di Monza has become a synonym for transgression, hidden desire, and rebellion against social and religious repression. The original records of Virginia's trial were guarded carefully. Many stayed under Church control and remained inaccessible for centuries. The Vatican decided to seal most of those archives, perhaps to protect the institution's image, or perhaps to prevent the wounds of the past from bleeding again. That lack of official information deepened the mystery. The empty spaces in the documents were filled with rumors, legends, and the imagination of writers and historians. Thus, the figure of Virginia became a realm of shadows, where the line between truth and fiction is constantly blurred. The case of the Nun of Monza was not unique. In France, during the 17th century, there were the famous cases of possession and scandal in the Convent of Loudun, where the nuns accused Father Urbain Grandier of witchcraft and lust, a process that ended with his execution. In Germany and the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, cases of abuse, corruption, and crimes inside convents were also documented. Such scandals were used by Protestant reformers as weapons against Rome and forced the Catholic Church to increase its vigilance. Similar episodes were known in Spain, although many were silenced or quickly hidden. The pattern was always the same: a noble young woman forced to take vows, an oppressive system that enclosed her for life, and inevitable human conflicts that led to tragedy. The story of Virginia de Leyva, therefore, was not an exception, but the extreme reflection of a much broader reality. And here arises the great question that transcends time. Who was Virginia de Leyva truly? Was she a victim of a cruel system that condemned noble women to a destiny they did not choose, taking from them their youth, freedom, and right to decide? Or was she a monster who, upon tasting freedom through her forbidden love, crossed every moral boundary and committed irreparable acts? Perhaps the answer does not lie at one extreme but in the middle ground where oppression and rebellion meet. The historical Virginia appears as the result of a system that turned convents into prisons and forced people to live against their most human desires. Yet the individual Virginia also carried responsibility for the actions that marked her life and the lives of others forever. The story of the Nun of Monza is not merely one of scandal, sin, and punishment. It is, above all, a disturbing mirror of the society of her time and, in some way, of our own. It shows how systems of power, when imposed upon human lives without granting freedom or dignity, can create monsters who are both guilty and victims. Virginia de Leyva was remembered for centuries as a symbol of corruption and sin. But today, when we revisit her story, we can also see in her a silenced voice, that of a woman used and condemned by the same structure that imprisoned her. And now the question remains in our hands: Virginia de Leyva, was she born a monster, or made into one by the oppression of her time? And what does her story reveal about our own society and the boundaries of justice and compassion?